Okay, welcome to New Progressive Voice. We have a guest on today, Drake. Welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you with us. Today we're going to be covering a few things, progressive strategy. We're also going to be talking about Biden, Tara Reid, Supreme Court justices, so forth and so on. So one of the things that anybody that's been following me recently may note is I've been reaching out to various people within the progressive community, ultimately with the goal of building an alliance or progressive coalition. Drake has agreed to come on to talk about some of that. Drake, can you introduce people to who you are? And he has a channel known as New Progressive Era, and how you got that going, and what inspired you to open that up.
Yeah, well, I'm a young kid from around here in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up kind of just working class background, seen a lot of things, was exposed to a lot of things. So for me, living the life that I had to growing up, that was something that I wanted to change for the kids who followed in my footsteps. And I dedicated to myself to that mission from a very early age. So I started New Progressive Era. It's a channel. It's pretty small, like 3.4K subscribers, and I just make videos every day, just talking about like youth activism, politics, just everything dealing with the progressive movement. And slowly but surely, it started to grow. And I'm just trying to come on here today and keep spreading that message.
That's awesome. It seems like we already have something in common, New Progressive.
Yes, sir.
So
Yes, sir.
that's nice. Now, when you were thinking of opening the channel and you were thinking about the channel name, what was going through your mind? Was there anyone in particular that maybe inspired you? Was it Bernie or someone else, or is just something else that got you to think about that title?
Bernie was huge for me. Like when I was maybe about 12, 13, that's when he started running. And that was the first time I'd ever even paid attention to politics. Like I also watched Kyle Kalinske of Secular Talk, TYT a little bit back in the early days. So like I knew I wanted to kind of be the younger part of whatever movement was happening, what was starting to happen with Bernie's campaign. Um, so I just thought of New Progressive Era, because like,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's great visualization powers you got there because you're exactly manifesting that today with us. So you definitely are young and fresh and you got things going for you. So
sure.
um, so let's get right into the meat of things. So there's a few things that are at the top of our list in the media right now. Among them are Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. Now, what is your own understanding about third party versus Biden, maybe some of the negatives and positives of either or either?
Well, I do know that Donald Trump is disastrous. We've seen the 4 years of his presidency with the tax cuts, with the lack of climate change policy whatsoever. Just I don't know, just everything that he stood for with foreign policy and just America standing overall. Like we see how disastrous he is. But I also know a lot about Joe Biden, particularly for the African American community, with him, having a tough on crime type of record, throwing millions of black and brown people in prisons. In terms of the foreign policy, being voting for the war in Iraq, being in the Obama presidency with the drone strikes and everything. So like both suck to me, but what I do know is that Biden has the advantage of he'd be less disastrous for the Supreme Court, and of course, as a young person, I care about climate change. He at least has a climate policy, so I'm weighing that in my decision if I'm going to just suck it up and vote for him and choose a lesser two evils little shit scale dance again, or am I just going to go ahead and just sit it on out. But what I can say is that I'm weighing the Supreme Court, I'm weighing climate change, and I'm weighing just the fact that Donald Trump is absolutely insane.
Right.
So he's just like he's
Yes.
unhinged. So I like
Right.
I weigh all of those things into that decision. But so far I haven't really come to a definitive conclusion. I used to say I'm not gonna support him, but like at this point I'm either choosing Joe Biden, either sitting out or perhaps voting Green Party. But it's kind of an even thing for me. I'm just gonna wait and see what
Kind of
happens.
a toss up right now.
Yeah.
So, one of the big stories out there right now regarding Joe Biden is, of course, Tara Reid. So on a couple of levels now, my own take on it is that we allow that to kind of work itself out through the court system, the legal system, and politics be separate to that. But of course, at
Hmm.
the same time, obviously, we have to be mindful of what she's putting out there. What are your own thoughts on that whole debacle?
You know, it's it's not unexpected for me. Like we've seen Joe Biden be very handsy with people before. Like he has like this like Uncle Joe thing where he like comes up behind them, she's
Right,
very
right,
touchy and like that's just who he is. But
right.
when like the allegations are credible. Like there was new evidence came out today, like a court document from a divorce in like '96, and he like the dude she was divorcing cited, yeah, that she had like this very traumatic experience with this senator, and that's affecting her today. So like clearly something happened. We don't know to what extent, we don't know to what severity, but I do know that something happened and something, at least in terms of harassment. I don't know if
Mhm.
it's assault, but the Democrats' hypocrisy, like with Stacey Abrams, Kristen Gillibrand, all these female Democratic figures coming out and endorsing this guy when it was Kavanaugh, when it was Clarence Thomas, all these other figures, they were like, we believe all women. Now all of a sudden they don't believe all women. So that's annoying to me. But what I will say is that Donald Trump has dozens of sexual assault
Right, right.
allegations against him. If you're weighing
Mhm.
who's worse for women and who's more of a fucking prick, I mean,
Right. Yeah, and a couple things come to mind as you're speaking. You're kind of getting my brain going here. One is whataboutism. Of course, we have to consider that, Trump versus Biden. And the second piece is the sort of this, like you said, a double standard when it comes to the Democrats, and how they were going after Kavanaugh, and then now the way they're treating Biden. It's clearly there's a discrepancy there.
yeah,
Now, we also understand GOP does exactly the same thing, calling for who
absolutely,
was it, Al Franklin to step down. But when it comes to
yeah,
Trump,
yeah,
um, so we got a major corruption problem in this nation, no doubt about it.
yeah, for
So
sure.
that brings me to your thoughts about this understanding of progressives who idealize wanting to have the battle where we would like it to be versus where it actually is. What are your thoughts about that kind of just me positing that the difference between those two, and how do we sort of maneuver through our current landscape politically as we're thinking about what we might do?
But like might do in terms of what?
I think often what happens is for the progressive community, we want to be able to live in a world where we have the ideal candidate and we go third party because we think that
Yeah,
that's going to get us somewhere. Well, ultimately, it doesn't really get us anywhere. It kind of spins the wheels. But yet we're in the same dilemma of having to pick between these two, you know, Trump and Biden.
it's
So that's what
crazy.
I mean. Wanting to have the battle where we would like it versus where it really is. How do we balance those two and sort of
Yeah,
brainstorm what we should ultimately do in your mind?
I get your question. Well, I think that a lot of progressives, particularly in the online circles, have been very naive about what they can expect from these politicians. Like, for example, I remember after like Super Tuesday, and you had Bernie sort of falling off a cliff in the sense with his campaign. What I saw was a lot of progressives calling him a sellout, calling him weak, calling him all types of names. And then
Right.
once he dropped out and endorsed the guy and voted for the bailout, and then AOC kind of followed in similar fashion, endorsed Biden. She voted against the bailout. But just like in terms of how we're holding our leaders accountable with the movement, they have been very almost disrespectful and naive in assuming that they have all of the power.
Right.
I
Exactly.
genuinely feel like change is something that's always going to be slow moving, but you can accelerate it at certain points with mobilization, with activism, with actually getting involved and getting off your ass and just speaking into Twitter and actually doing something in terms of protests, demonstrations, and having your voice heard. Um, and I just say that, like, yes, we can hold them accountable when they actually sell us out, but they have consistently been there fighting for our interests. It's just a matter of if you take the bailout for example, and progressives do this a lot of times with every politician, but like with the bailout, like could Bernie and AOC have actually held up the passage of the coronavirus
Right.
relief package? Like, could they really have done that when it was their ass on the line and you had millions of people, lives at risk, millions of people getting unemployed, like now starving? Like, could that really have been? No, of course
Right.
not. They
Yeah, I'm
did the
glad
best
you
they
bring
could.
that up, Drake. That's excellent that you are bringing it up because I think that's so lacking out there in the sort of the progressive echo chamber. Not looking at things pragmatically and realizing exactly like you said, had Bernie or ALC attempted to hold up that bill, then everybody would be screaming, that was $1,200 you held up, and
Right.
people are dying, so they can't win, no matter what they do. So we're not really behind them, and we're as quick to turn on them as we
Right.
are to give our money to them. And so there's that duplicity going on there. So I completely agree with you. And I'm glad to see that people like you, we're beginning to see this, and it's going to be the next step moving forward. In terms of the coronavirus, how do you feel that factors in terms of, as you were talking about, we certainly want to have the battle where it is, but we can also do what we can in a realistic manner to accelerate things. How do you think the coronavirus crisis factors into that process?
I think that it can either be an accelerant or it can be a deterrent, because what you're seeing is a lot of people are fed up and angry. Like when you see 36 million people unemployed in 7 weeks, there's a lot of anger and confusion and fear out there. And I think that it's now on us to either utilize this crisis to galvanize our movement, or just allow this crisis to just, let the people in power just clamp down on their power. Like with the establishment Democrats, with Trump, and just with everyone who's actually going to have a seat at the table. We can either use this crisis to further our agenda and show that no, universal health care, having a moratorium on rent evictions and foreclosures, taking care of the working class instead of the donor class. I think you can use that to further that agenda, or you can sit back and just play the little blame game and point fingers at each other. And that's really what I've tried to be focusing on, like throughout this whole pandemic. Like, talk about what progressives would do better, and show people that our political ideology and our movement is the way to go. Because I think a lot of people are now kind of looking for what's going to be the next move here. Like a lot of people are disillusioned by Trump and Biden, and you have this huge pandemic and potential economic depression thrown into the mix. People are going to be looking for a route to go down. They're angry and scared and confused. And I think we have to show that we are the legitimate option moving forward.
Absolutely. I feel like you just dropped the mic, boom, because you hit it right on the nail. You and I are completely in alignment with that strategy. The understanding that we have been spending far too much time criticizing the establishment at the expense of growing our volume, getting our voice out there and growing our movement, building alliances, building coalition where power really is. And of course, I'm
Absolutely.
not taking away the fact that, being critical is obviously important. But I would argue that, building the coalitions, doing the work is perhaps more critical. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And that was part of why Bernie's campaign faltered.
Hmm.
I think that was certainly the main factor behind it. We can talk about how, oh, he wasn't a negative enough, but the fact of the matter is he wasn't able to branch out beyond the 30% of the party that is staunchly progressive. Like
Right.
then the rest of the
Right.
party, they're drunk on CNN, MSNBC. They're being told you're not electable, so you have to reach out and build a coalition with them. They all agree with you on the policy, so market yourself in a way that shows, hey, I'm the real electable candidate. This guy, this guy's just not, you know?
Well, you're a step ahead of me because I was going to ask you what would be our next step in the process, and you mentioned it a couple of times. You mentioned the word coalition building and alliance
Yeah.
building. How does that look in your mind when you have progressives splintered into different camps, be it Yang, Tulsi, Marianne Williamson, Bernie Sanders, whoever? How do we bring people together,
Mm.
considering that everybody's so like campish?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was tougher because perhaps with Bernie and his people in the years between 2016 and 2020, I don't think they did enough to have a definitive plan on who is going to hold the mantle. I feel like Bernie and Elizabeth should have had the conversation long before. Like, yo, one of us needs to run and one of us needs to just give it up. I don't think they even had that conversation.
Mm.
And it's like moving forward, whoever's going to be the person who now holds the mantle, whether it be AOC or I don't know whoever, like they're going to need to do that work before talking to all of the progressive politicians around the country, courting their endorsements, like starting now,
Mhm.
really. Like starting now saying, yo, if I run in 2024, will you endorse me? Will you throw your support behind me? Talk to the organized labor, talk to all the activist groups out there and say, hey, if I run in 2024, will you be there to support me? And by then you have
Absolutely.
that coalition.
Absolutely. You're talking about a critical playbook, that is sound, a strategy. And we saw that play out wonderfully, perhaps one of the most savvy political moves in a long time within the Democratic establishment, where at the 11th hour, Biden steps in or Obama steps in, gives a call to so and so,
Yeah,
and the Buttigiegs and the Klobuchars of the world set aside their ego, and they all go
yeah.
out and endorse Biden. So you're absolutely right. There needs to be something from our leadership within the progressive circles that, learn from that playbook. Now, how about on the ground level among supporters of the progressive cause? What can we do to start trying to heal wounds and separation and come together under a common umbrella or cause?
I think that, and this is obviously way harder than is just said. Like it's like in terms of actually putting it into action, it's much more difficult. But I think in the coming years, as the lockdowns are lifted and just everything kind of settles back closer to normal, you got to get people out in the street, and not just get people out in the street just with blind rage, but have like a real agenda that you're trying to put forward. And I think there's going to be plenty of fear and anger to tap into. Like the economy is a literal shit fest right now. People are going to want to go out in the street and fight for their rights and fight for their interests. They're going to want universal health care. They're going to want a more balanced education system. They're going to want a living wage. They're going to want progressive reform. So it's going to be us getting out in the streets and having a clear agenda. And that's going to be uniting organized labor with all the activist groups and all the youth activist groups. It's going to be us coming together with like 3 or 4 just
Mhm.
concise demands. And I think it literally just looks like millions of us in the street, like civil rights era type of stuff. And like if that's what manifests, I think all of this change that we love to talk about, I think that's how it comes. But just being silent and just keeping our rage focused on online, I
Mhm.
don't think that's not going to get us anywhere.
Right, right. Yeah, you're exactly right. Keeps us in our little bubble, and the mainstream media is going to drown us out anyway. Now, a couple of things you mentioned, I think, are really vital to repeat because I think you're right on target. The first one is this understanding of within the leadership, you have to have someone that knows how to organize, knows how to build alliances and coalitions. And we did see that Bernie, although he is the fire starter, of the modern progressive movement, and we respect him and we always will honor him, he lacked that understanding of how to really do that early on. Whereas you see, Andrew Yang is a good example, someone who seems to know how to do that, and he's working on
Absolutely.
that. On the ground, I'm certainly not pushing everybody toward Andrew Yang. I'm just giving that contrast so we can bring that out, gel that out more. Now, in having a leader that understands that and is charismatic can, kind of work across the aisle, but still get our goals going. And then the second thing you mentioned, which I think is very important, that I think progressives often lose sight on, and I'm glad you brought it up. And I'm reiterating this because it's so vital what you're saying. You mentioned that we have to have 3 or 4 policies that we get behind, and I think you, I've been waiting to hear that from someone else because that's so right. Because this idea that we're going to get everything on our Christmas list, and get out there and demand that is just so not realistic.
Absolutely.
It needs to be, as you said, 3 or 4 hardcore. Now, you also mentioned, organizing, which Bernie is so fantastic at doing. So
Yeah.
we can learn from Bernie, we can learn from Yang. You mentioned the Supreme Court, you mentioned climate change, you mentioned, and I'll just throw in there science. Let's just briefly talk about how we can support our progressive candidates, be they Bernie, Tulsi, Yang, Williamson, with the hopes they may get a position in a Biden cabinet. But let's briefly talk about what it might look like in the next 4 years, Biden presidency versus Trump reelection. Can you contrast for us what you think those might look like, setting aside the Tara Reid allegation, which will leave
Yeah.
neutral right now because that's working itself through the court and the media system?
Right. It's it's certainly different. It's certainly different. I think with 4 more years of Trump, you see more of what we've seen before. He's like Trump wants to market himself like this kind of faux populist, but we all know he's basically a standard issue Republican. I'd say he's Bush, but just better on trade. And just with the tax cuts, with the neoconservative style like economic policy, deregulation, of course, and then he's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. God bless her. She's probably on her way out, and he's going to replace her with someone who's more of a Trumpian view of the legal system, and that's going to be disastrous because now it's 6-3. You know,
Right, right.
and that's obviously huge. Nothing gets done on climate policy when the IPCC. I don't know if you know this, but they set out a deadline saying that by 2030 we have to cut emissions by half, or it becomes irreversible. The clock's ticking. By then we're at 2024, and this guy's still increasing our emissions, still increasing all fossil fuel production in the United States. So it's disastrous if
Right,
that's
right.
Trump. But under Biden,
And not to mention that he doesn't believe in science.
yeah,
When you
it's
saw how he managed this, we have another crisis. God forbid.
yeah,
Wow.
it's crazy. And I'll say under Biden, you do see some similar themes. I do think that he is someone who would leverage the working class in exchange for a crumb. You saw Obama do that at the beginning of his presidency, right? In exchange for unemployment provisions, we extended the Bush tax cuts, all going towards the 1%. So I do think we'd see something similar with that, but it's markedly better. It's certainly markedly better. It goes against a lot of my principles. I don't think he'd fight for universal health care. I don't think he'd fight for tuition-free college. I don't think he'd fight for a living wage. I don't think he'd fight to move towards a Green New Deal. He said he would veto Medicare for all if it got to his desk, but certainly better. It's certainly better. And
Right,
millions
right.
more people insured instead of scaling back Obamacare. That's obviously better. That's millions more people who don't have to go bankrupt if they
Right.
get cancer or like life-changing disease. So, and then of course we have the Supreme Court. We put in a centrist, center-left type of justice in there, and then we move the needle a little bit on climate change. So it's markedly better, but it goes against a lot of my principles, which is something that I have a problem with. But I'm figuring it out.
Yeah, though, you probably know this already, Drake. I'm a little older than you, but you're very bright, and I can see that you catch on things very quickly. And one of the things I've had to come to terms with over the course of keeping my channel open off and on for the past 4 years or so is this understanding of what does it mean to be principled, because I think of principles without results, to me are kind of, it's sort of like buying the gear but not being able to use the gear, sort of like that.
Right.
So I think ultimately what we're talking about here is not so much that we have faith that Biden would do anything that's principally important to progressives, as much as create an ambience, an environment in which, we might be able to function a little better. So now, can you contrast for me what you think it might look like for the progressive movement under a Trump presidency versus a Biden presidency? Now, before you go there, I wanted to point out something, because as you were talking, it came to my mind. I think it's important to say this idea that progressives have to have a sort of like a figure that has a baseball bat to remind establishment, to
Yeah.
cater or bend to our will, someone like a Trump. I just think it's a false notion, in my opinion. I think we once believed that. I once believed that as well. I just think it's not true.
This is what I'll say. I think that principles principles are important, but I do agree. Like I agree with the notion of what you're saying. I wouldn't go as far as to say they don't matter as long as you don't get results. I feel like if you hold yourself to your principles, at least on some level, like it's a tough thing because obviously you want to hold this guy accountable. You want some type of punishment for the fact that they don't fight for our priorities, and not just our priorities, but according to the polls, the country's priorities. So like that's something that is disastrous to me, and you want them to be held accountable in some type of way, but you don't want to risk the livelihood of millions. You don't want to risk the
Right.
future of this country by withholding your vote, and that's something that
Right.
I've had a struggle about. And
It's how might we do that then, Drake? How, presuming Biden does get into office, how do we prevent some people from going back to sleep, and how do we hold the moderates accountable? How do we do that without a Trump? Because that's kind of what, it's sort of like that's why we, progressives are considering a third
yeah.
party or even voting Trump, simply to keep them accountable. Minus that, how do we keep the DNC accountable?
I think that holding the DNC accountable looks like in the 2022 midterms, primarying the hell out of them. In
Mhm.
2024, primarying the hell out of them. In 2026,
Absolutely.
primarying the hell out of them. That means, as I said, I'm going to keep reiterating this, inside outside strategy, to use Cal Kalinski's words. You get millions of people out in these streets behind 3 or 4 demands, having organized labor and activism united, and you hold their feet to the fire. You like hold the economy hostage, have labor strikes, hold business hostage. And if you do that, they have to listen. And I honestly believe that in these times, in these crazy unprecedented times, there will be enough people who give enough of a damn to actually join a movement like that. Um, this is what I'll also say. You asked me about the progressive movement and what it looks like under Trump or Biden. I think under Trump, honestly, we do have a better outlook moving forward. I think that you only have 4 more years, only sentenced to 4 more years. And the country continues to go to shit. More and more people might become indoctrinated in
Presuming
your thoughts.
he's not joking about being president forever.
Facts, facts, facts. But and then under Biden, whoever his VP is the shoe in for 2024, and
Right.
that's a much more difficult like battle to overcome. Like when you're talking about 2024, and even 2028. But what I will say is, do you want to risk like the potential? Oh, our movement might be in a better position in terms of national politics. Might, maybe, we'll see, or the surefire fact that millions of people lives will be an incredible risk under this
Right.
guy versus Joe Biden. That's something I
Yeah.
I
Right.
honestly don't really care about how the progressive movement looks under Trump or Biden. I just know that what I'm planning to do and what a lot of other people plan to do is get my ass in the street and get a picket sign and start fighting. Like I that's really what it has to do.
You made 2 points that I think are so central to this discussion: being proactive, taking responsibility for our own movement, and unplugging from this codependent relationship, waiting for mommy and daddy to, throw us our Christmas gifts.
Yeah.
So that's a maturation of the progressive process, right? Is it not? So you caught on to that quickly. That is awesome. Like we need to get more people to come to that revelation, right? And the second piece that you sort of induced in a quiet way. You said it earlier, but you sort of catched on it again here at the end, where you essentially were saying that we just don't have the power or the voice in Congress, and those down ballot tickets. We've got to get that changed, and then we'll we need to have a sort of more realistic snapshot of where we are here.
Yeah.
So. All right. Now, anything else you'd like to talk about regarding progressive strategy before we move on to the next topic? Because what I'd like to talk about with you is the the gentleman that was jogging and he was shot down, and that
Mhm.
story, and kind of how that factors into our
Yeah, that's
current
crazy.
climate. Now, any other
No, no.
comments you want?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we good.
Thing for me is first I don't want to stereotype. So what is your own upbringing in terms of your socioeconomic experience?
Yeah, man. I grew up in a working class neighborhood here in Atlanta. I'm actually out in the suburbs right now, chilling with my grandma. But I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, Old Fourth Ward. I saw gentrification. Like when we moved there, like you had crackheads running up and down the street, police sirens, gunshots, like the whole stereotype. Lived like 2 blocks from some projects, and then all of a sudden, white people start moving in, and
Mm, hmm.
we
Right,
and
right.
like we had to move out. Our rent got hyped up, and now we're out in the suburbs. So I lived that type of stuff firsthand, man. I've seen guns pulled. I've seen kids bring knives and guns to school. Like that's just what I grew up around. Like we never, there was never a point where like we were completely drowning and struggling, but there was a point. There have been plenty of points where we were barely keeping our heads above water. That was my life. Now, in terms of my skin color and in terms of being a young black male in America, I've seen it. Like I've been stopped by police. Dudes just like harass me, like, "Yo, what you doing? Why you walking at this time of night?" Like I've had that happen before. I've had people follow me around stores because they think I'm a threat. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for me, like being, especially down here in Georgia, like that stuff is normal. So when I saw that video, I honestly, I barely had a reaction because that
Mm,
type of stuff happens all the time. This like it's just lucky that the footage got leaked. That type of stuff happens all the time. Police kill people all the time. Like this isn't like,
Right.
you know,
So sad.
it's just a fact of life in America. And again, I hate to always minimize the class part of it because race is still a problem, and it's certainly things are becoming more progressive in terms of the culture, but race is still a problem. But it's especially evident in terms of the class. When black families own one tenth the wealth of white families, when our children are consistently going to worse schools and have worse health outcomes, living shorter lives and just less
Right.
quality lives. I mean, that's it's just the way it is, and that's the way it is in America.
So what I wanted to ask you is, now you were, really young when Obama was president and Biden was
Yeah,
president or
yeah,
vice president. But do you remember? I think for a lot of people that are not African American, they might say, "Oh, look, we're advancing." Obama was president, and he did whatever he did. But then we see Ferguson. Now, obviously, you can't extrapolate and speak for the entire African American community, but just for you personally and people around you, maybe your parents, what was your own translation of that experience? Obama being president and Ferguson, how all that came down.
bro, it was crazy. Like, so I distinctly remember the day Obama got inaugurated, like, because it's Atlanta, it's a black city, everybody was going crazy because
Mm,
somebody who looks like you was in the White House. That's crazy,
right.
So
Absolutely.
like, I remember my first grade class. I was like maybe 6, 7 years old, and I was in first grade class in like 2009, whatever it was, and Obama was getting inaugurated. My teacher was crying, kids were crying, my mom was crying, everybody was. It was a transformative spiritual experience for a lot of people, like particularly the older ones, because older black people, like these are people who grew up with, had to deal with lynchings, had to deal with the civil rights era and dogs biting them and water hoses being like
Right.
that's what they grew up with. So to see the transformation to a black man being put in White House, that was crazy. But for me, when I became politically informed, maybe around 11, 12 years old, growing up, I saw that this guy dropped the ball.
Hmm.
Like he came in as the hope and change candidate, and then sells working class out on a variety of issues, particularly the African American community. So it's definitely a bittersweet type of thing, just seeing what he ended up representing, but also the hope that he represented. And with Ferguson, like, again, that type of stuff happens all the time.
It's
It,
kind of
it
like
just,
a love-hate relationship with Obama and Biden, right? Isn't there? It seems to be. I notice particularly the older African American generation, they tend to really love Joe Biden, but then the younger, but that of course goes
yeah,
across, racial, lines. So it seems nothing unique, I guess, to the African American community.
yeah, for sure.
Uh, but I think one of the things that oftentimes people that are not African American don't seem to really understand is the experience of Ferguson and the experience of having Obama and that sort of, that cognitive dissonance, that being in that state of like, wow, we have this president, but yet we got
Yeah,
these riots. It's just really, really hard to manage that, mentally, like. Particularly if you're African American, I can imagine you're like so hopeful, like we're changing, but then boom, um,
yeah, man.
things I thought about in terms of the police shootings is I noticed that there seems to be a misunderstanding with the police force about some of the cultural differences in the way that African Americans respond to, and I'm making general stereotypes here, of course, not all African Americans, but generally speaking, respond to situations than, say, a Caucasian American. Would you say that's true? Like when an African American feels threatened, that in general they have a different sort of way of managing or responding to threat than, say, a Caucasian American in general?
I mean, I know if a police officer is starting to get a tone with me, I'm shutting my mouth. I ain't saying nothing. I'm being respectful. I'm saying, sir, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. I'm just moving slowly, no sudden movements. Like every black child, particularly a black man, gets that talk when they're like, like when they start to not just look like a little kid anymore. It's like when I hit puberty, like I was like maybe 12, 13, I got that talk. And that was that. Because now I know how to conduct myself. If I'm in a police encounter, ain't no way he's shooting me. I'm being
Mhm.
totally and completely respectful. And sometimes the emotions get the best of you. Like, you're a human being, and you end up getting
Right.
shot because you're black.
Right.
That's just how
Hmm.
it goes. And
Right.
for me, I try to make sure that I'm always taking care of myself and taking care of the people that I love. So, when I grow up one day and have kids, they're gonna be black, and I'm gonna give them the same exact talk, because it's a reality that you have to deal with.
Yep. Absolutely. What are your own thoughts about some of the steps we can take to remedying that? The way people see African Americans, that are particularly in the poor neighborhoods, and why they're not able to have upward migration in the economic social realm.
Man, the same stuff that we like to talk about as progressives, when it comes to even in the scales of opportunity, when it comes to healthcare reform, and you have universal healthcare, when it comes to tuition-free college, when it comes to a massive jobs program, Green New Deal, infrastructure investment, all that stuff would directly alleviate some of the ills that we see in our community. But these are communities that have been left behind. Like, our kids can't go to college. They literally can't afford it. Our kids and our more immunocompromised people, they're literally dying out
Right.
here, because they don't
Exactly.
have access to healthcare. This is what happens, man. And like literally, due to COVID in my state, black people are like 40% of the state, but 80% of the deaths due to COVID are black. And so you see that, if to balance the scales and to kind of just show that if we have the opportunity, we're just as able as white counterparts, our Latino counterparts, purple counterparts,
Hmm.
whatever. We're human beings just like y'all. So to even the scales you would see our community rise in a lot of ways. All the progressive reforms that we talk about, those would directly impact our communities in amazing ways.
Yeah, I think that goes to, in my mind, it goes to the core of trying to understand that racism is so embedded still into the system. Like talking about redlining and stop and frisk. Even the fact that Bloomberg had a hard time apologizing for his history of stop and frisk, and he's able to still run despite that history in the Democratic Party.
It's crazy,
Uh,
man.
it's really something. We're in 2020 and we have this. But you brought up the CV. Now, what's your own take on when would be a proper time, or how do we get guided? Because most certainly minorities, in this case, it's impacting mostly African Americans and Hispanics and Asians this time as well. So what do we do about that? Like, how would you, what's your thoughts on how do we open up and when do we open up and so forth and so on?
Man, to be quite honest with you, I want to get out. Like, I'm a young kid. I have friends. I just graduated high school, so like I want to go out and like do my thing. But it's also, I like I have a grandmother here living with me. I don't want to catch the virus and end up giving it to her. She's
Right, right.
immunocompromised. A lot of family members are immunocompromised too. Um, so it's a balance for me. I don't know what. Just listen to the experts. It's really all I can say. Whenever they tell
Exactly.
us to open up, that's when we got to open up. Like the hell do we know? Like, these are the ones who are the experts. Like, if they say we got to open up in December, we got to open up in December, and I'll follow whatever I got to do, because I want to protect my lovely Nana. I want to protect everybody. You know.
On the flip side of that is people who argue that the longer we stay closed, then the more economically dire it is for a lot of people, and that ultimately can lead to suicides and overdoses and
Oh,
other deaths.
Jesus.
So it's it's a very precarious time we're in, and
Yeah.
yet you have countries like South Korea or Japan that aren't seeing this kind of impact in their economy. They're certainly, they certainly have an impact, but not at anywhere near the death rate or the level of economic impact we're seeing here in the U.S. What do you think is might have been the cause of that in general? Like, why do we see such a huge difference in terms of the death rate and the way the economy is crashing compared to, say, South Korea or Japan or even China, which has much larger population and was at ground zero?
Because here in America we have a corporatocracy. It's of, by, and for the corporations. So the corporations wanted to make sure, hey, we need to be taken care of with this bailout, and we need to reopen soon so we can get back to making money and doing our thing. So they had their ear in the ear of politicians who were sold out to them, That's exactly what ended up happening, especially with the
Mm,
Republican Party now trying to reopen so fast. That's not, because they're just itching to go to Applebee's or get some McDonald's. No,
right.
they're trying to make money. They're trying to make their friends money. That's how it always works here in America. And when it came down to that bailout, giving trillions of dollars to the huge corporations and giving the working people crumbs, giving the SBA crumbs, giving the Paycheck Protection Program crumbs, that's exactly what happened. And now we're in a situation where there was this clunky, weird lockdown, and now they're reopening too fast. Huge amount of deaths. They didn't prioritize giving us ICUs and ventilators and things of that nature. And
Right.
especially with the economic fallout, you have millions of people unemployed, tens of millions. That was bound to happen. But now we're in a situation where they weren't protected. They were left out there to die. Now people are starving. People are literally like there's pictures all over the country of food lines wrapping around
Right.
buildings in the middle of a pandemic. They are so hungry and starving that they're like, I don't care if I get this virus. I gotta go get some food. My kids are
Right.
starving. This is the reality, and it's because the government did not take care of us. So if people want to blame the lockdown, that's just the most natural response. What you should be blaming is the government who left you and abandoned you and didn't give you the aid that you needed, whether it be a UBI, moratorium, or rent evictions, etc.
Exactly. I agree with that. And it talks about, I think you hit it on the head. It might have been part of what drove Trump to call it a hoax early on and almost take a month and a half before he even showed any like life about it. His
Yeah,
little finger was twitching. Um,
exactly.
so I think you're right, the money machine. And it definitely speaks to the need for a different leadership. And you brought up universal basic income as one solution. What is your own take on universal basic income and your own feelings about Andrew Yang?
I love Andrew Yang. I love that dude. He was like my second option to Bernie, like
Mm,
way over Elizabeth. And like, I like Tulsi. I'm a little iffy about her when it comes to economic policy, but with Andrew Yang, I just love him. He just seems like a dope dude. Like he pulled up to college. I'm about to be attending NYU, and he was just shooting hoops with the kids. Like I love that part of him. Just a cool dude. And also with the policy, I think the UBI is a tremendous idea, and you have the value-added tax on the side to help raise funds for any supplemental government services.
right.
I think I genuinely think that's a just genius. I just think that's genius. And I think it would help to ease the burden of a lot of the social services that we still have to provide with the states, with the local and federal governments. I think that once you have a UBI in place, people don't need that type of stuff. People are healthier, people are happier. I just believe in it. I believe in the UBI.
Exactly.
But one thing I do say is that it's still unpopular. If you look at the polls, a lot of people aren't in support of a UBI. I think it's drastically increased due to the pandemic. But before the pandemic, I think it was polling at like 30% or something. So it's something that you have to consider. So I think if the Democrats, like if we're in a situation where Yang's a nominee and that becomes part of the platform, I think they're going to have some work to do to convince the more indoctrinated of us that this is a tremendous idea and that you should get behind it. This isn't just a handout. This is literally saving the economy from automated ruin. I just think
Right.
it's this idea.
Yeah, actually, the latest poll that I saw, you're right. Like if we looked a couple months back, it was like 35 to 40%. Now it's up to something between 50 to 55% nationwide. Yeah.
Wow,
So it's just really, it's really on
that's
fire.
awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So Yang and sorry to say, the CV also has contributed to its popularity, I think.
yeah.
I know that Hillary Clinton thought about a UBI, but she couldn't figure out how to pay for it. Obama and Biden had Yang as one of the up and coming people at his White House that they met with, talk about his entrepreneur company. What do you think the likelihood is that number one, Biden would consider Yang for a cabinet position, and number two, that Yang would be able to get into Biden's ear and influence him toward a UBI?
I don't think one. I don't know if Biden's all the way there. I don't know if he's always going to be the one making those decisions. And then
Right.
um, I would say I just don't think with you with there's news of like Biden bringing in Larry Summers, and now he's
Yeah.
going to be in his ear about
Those
economic
are not
like
good
so.
indicators, are they?
I just don't think that they'd ever move towards UBI, but I think that if Yang stays relevant, and he's doing that now. He sued the New York Board of
Mhm.
Elections, and they actually won. So now they're gonna have the primary back on. He created some podcasts. Now he's out here like creating like relief foundations. I think as long as he does work like that and stays relevant, I think in 2024 he could run again and actually make a real run at it. So I
Yeah, I agree with
yeah
that. Anything else you'd like to cover? I think we covered quite a bit of territory,
yeah
uh, but I think it was awesome, really excellent, stuff that we covered, and you
yeah
put
for
out some
sure.
great suggestions about the progressive movement, how to move forward, how to, share just your own personal account of being African American in today's world, and talking about UBI and Andrew Yang, the Supreme Court, Joe Biden versus Trump. So we covered a lot of great topics. So,
Yeah for sure.
Drake, is there anything else you would like to share with progressives in general in our movement, or anything else?
Um, One thing I will say is stay motivated, stay alert. These are crazy times, and once all this is over, we have to mobilize, like get involved. Activism is going to be the key to all of this, especially if you're younger. These are the issues that are going to be directly impacting us moving forward for our future lives and any plans that we have and having a happy life. So this is it. We have to act and act now. So that's one thing I'll say to progressives and anybody out there who's just watching this clip. Like, stay motivated, man. Like, these are the issues that are going to be impacting our lives moving forward. We have to act. Um, and also, subscribe to the channel at New Progressive Era. Look it up. And follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram, whatever. And yeah, it was awesome having this discussion with you, man.
Absolutely, and thanks for all the good info. And I'll leave the link to Drake's YouTube channel and his Twitter. Overall, it really is about strategizing. It's really about building bridges, building a coalition is your message. And I think that's an awesome message. And you gave us a lot of good indicators and pointers about how we can start that process. And definitely activism seems to be a big piece of that. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much, Drake, and
Yeah, appreciate
hopefully we
it.
can have you on again. I mean, really, I'd like for this to become an ongoing thing for all of us. And once I get Zoom, we can have like four, five, six of us all like, you know, give an
Yeah, that'll be
example of what
awesome.
that looks like, and supporting each other's channels and growing each other's channels, getting people involved. So if you're up to that,
I'd love to. I'd love to. Yeah,
okay. So, all right. Well, thank you again, and it's been great having you with us today, and we'll talk again soon.
appreciate it.
Take care.
You too. You too.